Welcome everyone to our next session in stage one, which will explore the critically important perspective of the lonely individual, the reflections on living a lonely or disconnected life. This session will highlight what loneliness and/or social isolation looks like and feels like in a real-world setting. The Foundation for Social Connection, and I personally, believe that all experiences and perspectives shared deserve to be heard and to be given space to be heard. The experiences and perspectives shared here today may resonate with some of you, but they should not be construed to define any or all of you. We welcome the opportunity to make space for these perspectives and hope they spark interest in a deeper exploration of the myriad ways people might experience social disconnection. Our first speaker is Simone Heng, a human connection specialist and former international broadcaster for Virgin Radio Dubai, HBO Asia, and CNBC, among others. With over 15 years of experience around the world as a communicator on air, on stage, and one-on-one, connection has always been her life's work. Simone inspires people to connect in a world thirsty for connection. Simone's debut book on human connection, Secret Pandemic: The Search for Connection in a Lonely World, is a Singaporean bestseller, as well as an Amazon US #1 bestseller in the social science reference category. Please join me in welcoming Simone to the Action Forum. It's so good to have you.
Thank you so much, Edward. Hi, everyone. I'm coming to you from Singapore, where it is currently very late in the evening. Before I do get into my story, I do want to issue a trigger warning. There is some content in this about mental health, about loneliness, and as well about hoarding disorder and grief. So if any of those topics you find difficult, it may be a moment for you to now tap out. So in January of 2014, I left my dream job and my dream life in Dubai to move back to Australia to be with my mum. She had suffered a massive stroke that all people who suffer from her rare degenerative disease suffer, that puts them in a wheelchair until their death. I remember being very naive about the sort of use I would be for someone in that position. In Australia, when somebody becomes paralyzed and in a wheelchair, they're considered a two-person assist. This means that they have an incredible selfless carer that takes them from the bed to the bathroom, from the bathroom to the kitchen, and so on. I found myself sitting on the carpet in that nursing home, having given up my job to emotionally support my mother, feeling absolutely useless. When I think back now, it's 8 years ago, I think what I did was quite selfish, actually. I wanted to appease my Asian filial guilt, I suppose. And one day I asked her carers if I could help take my mother to the toilet. And this is where my mother's disconnection led to my own. I remember knocking on the door and asking if I could come in. She's in the bathroom, and the carers asked me that all I have to do is wheel out her wheelchair so they can get her commode in and take her to the toilet. Now, my mother had been fierce. She was a teacher at Singapore's most elite girls' school, so she had this scary authority. And as a child, she was this huge power, this force and influence over me, a real tiger. And I remember walking into that bathroom and seeing her nose to the bathroom tiles with her back to me, hands gripping onto a metal bar, with no clothes on except a giant nappy. A diaper is probably what you call it in the US. And I saw her gripping onto this pole, and like a bird with a broken wing, she was tipping side to side to side. And I had this moment where I realized that her identity was gone. The mother that I had known was lost. Her legs were atrophied from being in the wheelchair, and my face just crumbled in horror. And she glanced to the right in the mirror in that bathroom, and she saw my face. And she said, "Darling, are you okay?" And because I'd been in the media up until that point for so long, I just put this plastic face on. I was like, "Yeah, Mum, I'm fine." And I had one job. One job was just to take that wheelchair out of there. And the moment I closed the bathroom door, leaving her with her two carers, I sat on her hydraulic bed and I sobbed. I sobbed because I had moved back and left everything and everyone that I'd known and all my connection. And now I was rendered absolutely useless to be able to support this person. And the second thing that happens when people we love become differently abled in a family is that we're left with all of the physical things they left behind. So in my case, 35 years of my mother's possessions, 35 years of my late father's possessions, 70 years of their stuff. Now, my mother was a hoarder. And before you laugh, hoarding is, a mental disorder in the Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And it was only classified in 2013. So while they were off classifying it, I was in the flesh, knee deep, cleaning it. In this huge 8-bedroom house my parents had bought as an antidote to small apartment living in Singapore when they immigrated. And there, in my absence, when I was away for 10 years, my mother had gone from room to room to room, filling it from carpet level to ceiling height with stuff, literal filling of the empty nest syndrome. And I used to judge hoarding, like we all do. But I realized that hoarding is literally screaming out because you're lonely, but with possessions. Where I once saw a pile of clothes, I now see sculptures of loss. Where I once saw magazines after magazines and plastic bags and enough rubber bands to create a basketball, I now see tributes to trauma. And so my mother's loneliness led to my own, because I gave up my job that I'd then gotten on Australian radio to clean that house full-time for 6 months, 9 in the morning to 5 in the evening. I had no friends. I saw no one. And I knew it was my job. And here's the isolating thing about cleaning a hoard is, unlike when my dad died and you could explain it and the community understood, in this case, the community finds this topic of hoarding deeply uncomfortable. It's not like I can go to someone and say, hey, I really need help cleaning my parents' 70 years worth of stuff. What was in that house was also horrifying. When people clean hoards, I know someone who's found presents her father wrapped for his mistress. I have a cousin who found letters her mother wrote to the Vatican begging for a divorce from her father. It's not something you can outsource because family secrets are hidden in that hoard. And I went through it, and after 5 of the 6 months, I got to the final room, the room from which everything began, the master bedroom of my parents' house, where they had laid together for 35 years till death did them part, where my mother had soaked the mattress in tears following my dad's death. And I remember, I'm really small, I'm 5'1". And I remember pushing the door to the bedroom open to see the piles of things high above my head height. There was a mattress that had obviously just broken and she'd left in there. And it was almost like it was pushing the door closed, like to keep the room's secrets in. I finally got in there and I cleaned and I cleaned and I cleaned until one day I succeeded in getting to carpet level, the ground zero from where all of this began. And I found 3 bags. The first bag was full of all of my dad's x-rays from his kidney stones all the way to terminal cancer. Another plastic bag was filled with every condolence card my mother had ever gotten, consoling her on his death. And the final bag was full of every obituary she could find in every newspaper, statewide or local, and she'd cut it out and filled this bag. And I remember dropping to my knees and sobbing and realizing how alone she had felt, that she couldn't let these things go. And secondly, from the day my dad died, April 6th, 2004, this poor woman never threw anything away. So how did my mother's loneliness really lead to my own? There was a part of the room that I had been ignoring, and it was the bathtub that had long been clogged with dark water and receipts were floating on top. And I remember thinking, this is the last gift you give to your parents. I had been avoiding it as any human being would. I remember slapping on those kitchen rubber gloves, plunging my hand into the water, just taking the snatch breath and thinking, who have you become? In my loneliness, I had gone from 1.5 years before doing creative work, radio shows, public speaking, social media campaigns, all of these things. And in the last 6 months, I had no friends and I had essentially become a janitor for my parents. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's good, honest work, but it's not what I was trained for or passionate about or qualified in. And in doing that, I had started to isolate myself. And this is the biggest point that we know about what the lonely brain does. It starts with statements like this. I had a statement in my head in that moment that there was no other 30-year-old on the planet that had a father in the grave and a mother in a wheelchair, and no one could understand me. And I used that as a reason to isolate myself. And then that was the first stage of loneliness. What we know then is that the lonely brain continues to spiral and self-isolate. So from there, you hold people to unreasonable standards. You can read more on this in the work of Dr. Jim Cohn, but you keep people to an unreasonable standard. So if I was invited to a dinner, I would immediately think, well, the invitation was last minute. They probably didn't want me there anyway, and I would cancel. And then that becomes a vicious cycle. And you're more and more alone. The lonely brain is on high alert for social threat. It further isolates itself. And I wanted to tell you this story because I know when you look at me and Edward reads my bio, you would never think this would happen to me because I'm a classic extrovert. I love humans. I love people. But if this can happen to me because of a family tragedy, it can happen to anyone, which means it's probably happening to people in your circle right now. So I want to leave you just in closing with one action point. When I jump off this video and you finish listening to Aaron, who's coming up next, I'd love for you to scroll through your most used messaging app on your phone. Maybe that's WhatsApp or iMessenger. I want you to look for the people that you haven't heard from for about 6 months, whether they're an extrovert like I was or they tend to self-isolate. I want you to do them a favor and I just want you to reach out. Maybe a voice note, maybe a message. And if they write back, slowly mirror that with like a ping pong of interaction until you can elevate that to a phone call, video call, and then an in-person meeting. And why I say that is if you bombard a lonely person straight with a phone call, it can actually make the lonely person even more skeptical because of what's happening with the brain. So that's my green, sorry, I just read Adam's name. I'll read the comments. That is my wrap up of my very short 10 minutes sharing on my loneliest experience. I hope that it has touched your heart and made you think a little bit differently about the bubbly people in your life that may be suffering that you might not know about. From Singapore, have an incredible evening. If you want to talk further, my name is Simone Heng and you can find me online. I'll voice note you back in the DMs, I promise.
So let's pause and take a moment to respect the vulnerability that Simone just graced us with. Now, please join me in thanking Simone for sharing her deeply personal experience and inspirational perspective on the power of human connection and how insidious loneliness can be for us all. For me personally, parts of your experience with your mother resonate to my own family story, and I feel really blessed to have heard what you just shared with us, Simone, so thank you. I'm excited to now welcome to the stage our next speaker, Erin Callow. Erin is a social health advocate, local community organizer, social emotional health teacher, men's work facilitator, circle space holder, and thought leader committed to creating more meaningful human connection in our lives. Erin will touch on his own views and personal experiences of male loneliness, and we welcome Erin to the floor now. Thanks, Erin.
Thanks, Eddie. So nice to be here. And I have to say, after hearing Simone's story, how nice it is for us to be connected back to back in two ways. I wasn't expecting to say this, but I think it's important now. One is also being an extrovert, that so many of us who are out there in the world that I've experienced, who are out there making the connections, can also be, and I've experienced in my journey, be alone in the emotional journey. I think that's an important one to remember, that we can be alone amidst lots of people, even when we're the extroverted one. So that was a nice reminder, Simone. Thank you. And the second is I also relate to that story. My mother passed away from Alzheimer's. And the sad part of that story is when I moved her to be closer to me, she lost a lot of her connection and community. And I could see how her demise went precipitously down. So I can really relate to that. So thank you, Simone. I'm here to talk today about what it's like to be alone as a man. And I would just like to share with you basically my story and what I've uncovered as I really looked into this after looking at my own loneliness. And what I found was that the story of men's loneliness is very much overlooked, underserved, and probably one of the highest risk categories for a lot of what ails us in society today. So let me take you through a little bit of what that means. I'll start at a macro level and just talk about men in general. And remember, I'm talking about men from both a statistical standpoint, so it's not everybody, and then also my own experience. So this might not relate to you, but many of you might relate. So first thing I thought was interesting was suicide rates. Depending on the age category, that men are 2 to 6 times more likely to commit suicide. And that one really took me back for a second. The second one was incarceration rates. That the two highest incarceration rates across all sexes were 18 and 19 years old. So at that crucial age of a young man's life, and they were young men. And then the last one I'll mention, and I just read about it this morning, is that women are 2 times more likely to report depression than men. And what's interesting to me about that, and I'll touch on that a little bit before I finish, is that the most likely probability is that men aren't any less or more depressed than women. And I don't have the research to back that up. That's just my assumption. It's our inability to both recognize that and to talk about it openly. And there's lots of reasons why, shame being one of them. But let me tell you a little bit about my story and see where that lands with you, to see if this isn't a story for many men out there. So when I look at my experience, and when I was young, at a young age, I was taught that emotions were a sign of weakness. You know, that classic, like, you can't get angry, right? You can't express your anger. Anger is unhealthy. And we very much know today, based on all the research and all the therapy out there, that that's not true. And that sadness is not healthy. You know, the classic stop crying. I've told my own son that, and I've had to apologize to him in later years about that, because that was built into the way I was raised. So this inability to express my emotions in a healthy way. For me, every 2 years, we relocate. My mother was divorced and she never found the right home that felt like a community. So I never grew up with a sense of friends or a sense of belonging. And so all of the moving always had me looking out for, you know, who's going to be my friend, who can I trust, but always on a little bit of that edge. After that stage of my life, middle school and high school, trying to find my friend group, trying to find a place to belong, I realized that I could find a place of self-worth around producing an achievement. And so what I realized is, if I got into sales, if I'm the number one salesperson, I could achieve and I could build some identity around that. But as you guys probably already know, there's not much connection or belonging around that. I kept on going down the line like many of us do. I found entrepreneurship. I became a serial entrepreneur, built companies, sold companies, had all this success. But the reality is I was your classic lone leader at the top, forging his way forward, but hiding behind my leadership as a way with which to not connect with other people. So in many ways, all the friends that I did have as I was building these businesses was looking at the outcome as a way for me to feel fulfilled. I lost most of my friends as a result of my successful businesses and hid behind that leadership role. So as it went, after I had built and then sold my third company, I sold it to an organization that had a problem with me as a co-leader, and then we parted ways. And soon thereafter, that company went bankrupt, and I had lost basically my life savings in that situation. And that's not for anybody to feel sorry for me. It was actually the best thing to happen to me in my life. But what I realized at about age 40, when I looked around, is that here I am without my successful companies, and I had the first chance to really, truly evaluate my life. And I realized I was 40 years old and all alone. I had no one to confide in, no one I could feel like I could totally share my emotional experience, no one I can share the shame. I was ashamed of what had happened in my previous company, and all of these things were built up. And so this is from a man who's I would say, probably fairly entitled in the world, that I've been given every opportunity to succeed, although I didn't come from much means financially. But here I was, 40 and all alone. So in that, I was lucky enough to come into some Buddhist teachings, Zen Buddhism, and started my spiritual journey. And as many of us do, whether we're meditators or we're actually going down our own spiritual journey in other ways, we can get into that more inner sense of peace. But even after 10 years of finding peace, I realized still something was missing, and it was very simple. I didn't have connection that was meaningful, emotional, and real with other men. And I think you'll see that in a lot of other men these days if you look a little bit closer and behind the veils we put out there, especially when you start to look at things like when men go through divorce, how much pain and how much suppressed emotions happening. And that was happening to me in my experience. So that's just a little bit of a background story to set the stage for what it's like to be a man in the modern world. And now I think about today with our kids that are growing up, and the video games and the phone and Snap and Instagram and TikTok, and how many friends they have in real life. And I get very concerned for our young men, which is where I spend a lot of my time these days professionally, and how they are connecting to each other, because they have the same types of challenges of what they've been taught at societal level and how they've been raised, many of which I shared in my story, but now they have even more reasons to disconnect. And so I think we run into challenges. If we can look at how ourselves, how men, and whether you're a man or a woman, you can probably relate to a lot of this and seeing this in your male counterparts if you're not a man, is how we look at that through multiple lenses in the forms of what I would call aloneness, being alone in the experience. So there's the first one that I mentioned, which is emotional aloneness, how we're alone in the emotional journey, that we have no one to talk to, relate to, or feel even safe enough to share. And many times in the research and the thousands and thousands of men I've had a chance to work with, we don't even feel safe enough to talk to our spouses or our significant others. The reason being is there's lots of risk. As we share, there's risk of them thinking it's about them or them giving us advice. So we have all of these disconnects and not many places to do that, and not even feeling understood as a man. There's relational aloneness, which is the next big category, which is how you feel alone in your own relationship. There's the physical one when we talk about social isolation and how that happens. And then, as I alluded to, there's also a spiritual one where you don't feel met at a deeper spiritual or soul level. So there's all these forms of aloneness that come in at different places in time in everybody's life, but specifically for men. So let's talk about the emotional one here in the last few minutes, and then we'll close up and see if we have time for Q&A. But think about your classic man. Again, this is generalizing, so it's not every man, but this is my experience. That first and foremost, most of us men are not given many tools to even understand our emotions. We don't even know why we are angry and where that's coming from. And then secondly, we don't have healthy outlets to express it. The anger one is a really good example. When we have emotions, we're meant to express and process and release those. With unprocessed emotions, as most of us know, that is what we call trauma. And when the trauma lives in the body, this is where we have really challenging health, mental and physical problems. So there's no healthy outlets. Where can I express my sadness? Where can a man express his anger, especially if he doesn't have other men to do it with? Most of us men are really, really bad at the friend situation. We are not good at creating emotional connections with other men to do that. It's, think about the classic, hey, let's go have coffee and talk. Most men don't do those things. And there's a really good Saturday Night Live skit, if anybody wants to look it up on YouTube, around a group of wives taking their husbands to a playground as if they were little children and coaxing them into, hey, go play with the other men. And it really has a point there in that most of us guys just don't know really how to connect beyond some of the superficial levels around sports or alcohol or other things like that. So when we're not able to connect, we have a couple options. We have our emotions expressed outwardly. This is where a lot of violence comes in, by the way, and a lot of that gets expressed in those ways, and domestic violence and even in bigger societal violence that we see. But we also disconnect. So we start watching TV, we start getting addicted to sports and pornography, marijuana and alcohol, or even hiding behind our workaholism, which was mine as well. So we start hiding, we start disconnecting because we don't have a place for it. So we just really start to, just pull back from even those opportunities because we don't know what to do or how to do it. Again, this is my experience and the experience I've had with other men. So without this connection, what happens and what we see is mental health epidemic. I think this is an important distinction out there, is that I look at mental health as the symptom or the outcome of poor connection and emotional expression experiences, not as the cause. So when so many men are depressed or delusioned with life, that listlessness that you see, classic midlife crisis comes in with it, the anxiety, and then all of the physical ailments, cancers, ulcers, body shutting down. I've seen most of it in the group and coaching work I've done with men, that there's just a lot of ailments that come from it. And so most of those ailments I have seen being solved with men being able to be more emotionally connected to themselves and then having emotional connection to other men, that is a symptom. So in wrapping up here, I want to make sure we know what doesn't work out there, at least that I've seen. Talk therapy typically doesn't solve the connection issue. Men being told you just need to go make other friends doesn't work very well either. We feel a little bit of shame around that. Meditating alone is great for so many things, and I do it too, but it doesn't solve the loneliness issue. And go see a doctor doesn't necessarily solve it, the medications and such. So with that, I would say really what should we talk about is how we can end this shame and blame of what men are experiencing and how they're expressing themselves and really help men heal and grow. That's what I needed, and that's what I think most of us need in this world. I appreciate you guys listening, and I'll turn it back to Eddie to wrap us up here. Thank you guys very much.
Well, Aaron, your vulnerability really sets a powerful example, so thank you for it, and the world really is better for it, so thank you. Please join me in thanking Aaron for sharing his experience and research and for his continued commitment to addressing this issue for certain individuals who identify as men. We're so grateful to both Simone and Aaron for making space to hold these important discussions and to compassionately expand their experiences to impact others.